Hey, good morning, everyone. I am Joe Rizzo with the Loudon Museum, and this is the latest edition of our Pour Over History series interviews. And this morning, I am joined by local historian Bronwen Souders, who is coming out with a historical fiction book about Waterford here in Loudon County. So as soon as I heard about this book, Bronwen, I was excited with the idea of interviewing you and hearing a bit more about the book and some of the motivations behind it. So thank you so much for being willing to join us for this interview today.
Thank you.
And Bronwen, since I moved here, I've known you and your husband, John. You guys have been incredible helps to me with tracking down various local history information. And you all both have been big advocates for Waterford and for local history. How did you end up in Waterford, though? Just a bit about you, before we get into the book. And what about the local history have you always found so compelling?
All right, well, you've got two questions there. I'll start with how we found it. We'd been living in Arlington. We often came out to Loudon County to go to auctions. That was our dating entertainment. John had visited a grandmother in Winchester, Warrenton, and so he knew Route 7. Then we went to England and loved that, the open fields and all of that. And then one day we were out driving around and suddenly we come down Water Street and here is this village. We were just kind of amazed at. And then we saw a newspaper ad. It was a house for sale, 18th century house, needs extensive restoration. We went and looked at it. It felt terrific. It had 30 acres. It was originally part of a 600-acre farm. So we bought it, and that was 48 years ago. We lived very much as Levin's family lived in 1880. The plumbing was one cold water faucet. He didn't even have that. And an outhouse. The heat was the fireplace or a stove, or running around working fast. So we've slowly modernized it, and along that time, a story has kind of emerged.
Excellent. And you've done a lot of historical research, nonfiction for Loudon County, of Waterford. Is this your first crack at historical fiction, though? And really, what inspired you to try your hand at historical fiction, if it is your first time?
Well, it is, and I must say, first of all, I was bored with history when I was little. And then I come to Waterford and I live in a house that's been built by enslaved workers. They had lived there, died there. And suddenly history became much more relevant. It's just people like us, only at a different time. So let me see, where was the rest of that question?
Well, I'm just curious how you got involved with the idea of writing a
historical fiction. Yeah. So going through documents and diaries and wills and deeds, John and I both tried to work very hard on getting the right facts out. And with historical fiction, I often thought, well, the real history is just as good. Why do you make up something? But I came to realize with this story that I wanted to tell, to illuminate the Black history of the village, which had been 25% of the village population from about 1820 to 1950, that there was a chance to tell that story. Basically in the book, I go through the year 1880, giving the events that are important to the Black community. But I needed an antagonist and a protagonist, and that let me make up enough details that I would not offend any descendants. I guess I wanted to celebrate them, not offend any, and I certainly hope I haven't.
Nice. So let's get into your book then. You've mentioned Levin a couple times already, and that's the main character in your book. And a lot of the book is him reminiscing on his time in Waterford. Were there any particular Waterford residents who influenced your stories about Levin, or maybe any of the other characters that you introduce? Are there any real people who have influenced those characters?
Yes, there are several. The character of the deaf-mute girl, Maddie, who would like to be Levin's love interest, but is not. And Dr. Haskins, about whom descendants said You see that walking stick he carries? Well, I've seen it move just like a snake. He could turn it into a snake. And that was kind of intriguing. Then the names of Perina and Wesley, Levin's younger brother and sister. I was reading over a deed of 1820, 1830, white man in Waterford, and he talked, his inventory, state inventory, listed 2 enslaved children, Perina, age 9, I think, and her value, and Wesley's value. And so that kind of hit me between the eyes, so I wanted to preserve their names. But those are the 2. The Maddie and Dr. Haskins are really composites, as are all the other characters too. That's it.
And certainly there's, of course, historical background and a lot of research that went into any sort of historical fiction, of course, has an incredible amount of historical research. But as you were doing the research, or the stories that actually come up in the book, is there any one part or one story that maybe is most meaningful to you?
Well, it was sort of the part that I made up, and it happened so long ago that I can't figure out how I came to it. But that's the Thinkin Rug itself, the title of the book. And it's this little piece of braided rug that is not very imposing, and then something happens to it early on. And it's hugely meaningful to Levin's mother. And as you get into the book, you learn why it's so meaningful. And she describes it as something sentimental, and she can step on it and think fondly of her ancestry, her enslaved ancestry, and yet thinking of other events that happened, she could stomp on it and get her frustrations out. So the rug is definitely a character in the book. And I guess that's all about I can say about that.
Nice. And can you just tell us a little more about Levin as the character, about his life, and about some of the kind of key challenges or maybe that he goes throughout the book?
Yes, we see him reading a book in his attic bedroom by candlelight, and suddenly he hears banging outside, and that turns out to be Maddie banging pans. She can't speak because she's mute, and her father has taught her to bang pans if there's a fire. And so that launches the story, and we end up going through the year with Levin being impressed with a new girl who's just come to town and trying to discourage Maddie's intentions. We learn about their work out at a farm, which turns out to be the farm where John and I live. We live in the house and own 30 acres of what was originally 400 or 500 acres. So it was a going concern. And the antagonist comes in when the farmer, Mr. Jones, hires a foreman to help him build what we now call our big wing, the living room section. He's hoping for some grandchildren and thought he might enlarge the house. So a lot of the story is tied in with the building of that section and other events in the Black community's life. The butchering in the fall for their winter meat, the Emancipation celebration in September, Sunday school picnics, trying to show the sense of community within the Black community that so many of the descendants have passed down to me.
Yeah, and you brought up some good points, especially about Waterford sometimes being a bit unusual, especially within the rest of Virginia. Is there anything about post-emancipation Waterford that you really want readers to understand? Again, while it's historical fiction, you're getting a lot of great information about a place like Waterford. For readers or just people who are interested in Waterford, what do you think is really most important to know about the town, especially post-emancipation?
Well, the presence of a free Black population, which considerably outweighed the enslaved population from the late 1700s to when slavery ended, has been significant. Let's see, collect my thoughts here.
A lot of history. It's a big loaded question.
I can edit this out. I have lost my train of thought. Get me on again.
Yeah, I mean, Waterford always gets picked out, especially in Loudoun County's history. But I mean, there is a free Black population, but really, what's Waterford like after the Civil War for this formerly free Black population, but now really in a country where slavery is abolished?
It was better than before, but still not that much better. The historian Ira Berlin has written a book called Slaves Without Masters, and I think that describes their condition quite well. They were free, they could own their own buildings, some of them. In 1810, there were 4 Black families that owned their own property, which is most unusual in Virginia. And then the population steadily grew. Nevertheless, economically, even the free families were the washerwomen and the laborers, the fence builders, wood, stone. One woman in Waterford who was born in 1896 told me when she was 92 that she said washing day was amazing. You'd walk through town and all the sheets and towels were out on the bushes, as she called them. There were no clotheslines, I guess, or not too many. So everything was laid out on bushes. And then she told me how hard it was wringing out linen sheets. They're very strong, they're very tough, and they would be thick. And the amount of energy simply to get clean clothes in what few closets they had would have been tremendous. There was quite an exodus in the early 1900s. A lot of the parents went to DC to work. They went to New York. And as historian David Goldfield once said, if you want to see where the Black community went, look where the railroads went. So some in Waterford went to Chicago, some went to New York, some to Baltimore, a lot to New Jersey. And that meant if the working age parents were working, the grandparents were often taking care of the children. Or the working families in DC or New York would come back for the summer. And so many of the few remaining descendants left, born in the early 1900s, remember growing up in Waterford and how wonderful it was. And knowing people like Dr. Gaskins and Maddie, going to the school on 2nd Street. And it was the school on 2nd Street that really got me started on this. I role played one of the docents, and I also helped research some of the biographies of the children. And having not liked history much before, I was quite impressed how much information you can draw from the census. In the 1880 census gives who is a head of household, who the parents are, who's living. Sometimes you get the mother's maiden name, you get the children. You see that children as young as 12, 13, 14, 15 are not in school. They're described as laborers. So, again, catch my thoughts here. It just told so much. And when, 2nd Street School, we started in learning about the children. We learned the trustees. They were people like Daniel Webster Minor, Jonathan Kennedy, Matthew Harvey. And I was transcribing some years ago an oral history interview done by one of our interns. And the woman said, my grandfather was Daniel Webster Minor. And that just floored me. The descendants are around and they're here and I can talk to them. Well, I called her up immediately and sort of burbled how excited I was and could I come talk to her. And she said, well, excuse me, it's 5 o'clock in the afternoon and I've just stepped out of the shower and I've got to bake 12 dozen rolls for the Curtis reunion next week. Maybe I could talk to you after that. So that was the start of an amazing friendship and source of information. She shared the incredible eggnog that she made for Waterford families because she'd worked for a lot of the Waterford families, but then also had worked for Fairchild Industries during the war. So these wonderful conversations just really gave me a sense of what was going on, what could have been going on. The butchering, as I say in the book, went on as it probably had for 100 years. I think the last butchering by the Black community in Waterford took place shortly after we moved here in the early 1970s. And I did not visit it, but Joe Keating, the late Joe Keating, did, and took pictures, and it was a good bit of information that I derived from that to be able to write about the butchering chapter.
Yeah, and you mentioned how there's, still family connections and lineage going back to Waterford, but also just the physical structures in a sense too. It sounds like was, maybe a motivating factor too about, I always tell that about Waterford, for people not familiar with the area, that just driving through it, you get a sense of how it was, 150 or so years ago. Because in a lot of ways, the streets haven't changed and a lot of the buildings are, but you kind of feel the history when you walk through. It's almost like a continuous connection, just like, ancestors are too.
It really is. If you look, one of the first subdivisions of the village was in 1792, and it shows Main Street running from the mill down to the post office. And those lots that are described in that plat, gee, look you, page 170, are still there. The fences are there, the trees are there, the houses are there. There are a couple missing, like missing teeth. Sometimes they fall down. And let me see, John's been researching the 1820s, 1830s period and finding that even then there were decrepit houses and ones that were taken down. So it's been an active village for a long time. The roads to the village led from the often slave-held properties, which grew the grain, the Waterford mill ground that was sent to Washington, up and down the East Coast, and even to Europe periodically. So it was an industrial village in an agricultural setting, a haven for Blacks in a segregated state, and it fought for the Union during the Civil War. So there are quite a few contrasts and conflicts to its history all along.
Yeah, and with this book, and it is coming out recent or soon, or just come out or available soon. For people who want to and I will also mention too, for those at home, the proceeds I believe are going to the Waterford Foundation, of course, which does tremendous work for preserving Waterford's history and understanding it, and also the Black History Committee at the Thomas College Library, right? They're getting a portion of the proceeds.
Yes, they are getting the proceeds. Yes, to further the study of the history. There is so much here, and even during the war, the documents, that would be the late war, the Civil War, documents were moved away for safety and brought back. So we really have a pretty continuous bit of history here. And we're just sort of getting to the edge of living memory, where grandparents who are dying often have really good family information that contemporary descendants may not be aware is significant. So that's another thing where the Black History Committee is so good, and the foundation as well.
And is the book for sale on the Waterford Foundation's website right now? And I'll post a link to it as well that I have when I post this interview. But for other people, is Waterford Foundation the best place to go to purchase the book?
It is at the moment. I'm hoping that Oatlands might be able to sell it. There will be some local distribution, but for this point, the Waterford Foundation is the best place to go.
Great. And again, I'll post the link on this for those watching that want to pick up the Thinkin Rug. But lastly, Bronwen, is there a teacher's guide seminar you're going to hold for this too, with this book coming out?
We are going to do that early in the new year. I'm hoping the Black History Committee can help me with that, and we certainly have some teachers within the Waterford Foundation. My teaching ability, even though I was a substitute for a while, has really been confined to being Miss Nickens at the Second Street School. And that's kind of fake, because we learned the children who come all beautifully costumed, their historic name on their chest. And the teacher has said, you better behave or you're not getting another field trip. So they've been a joy to teach. No misbehaviors. We have to tell some child to pretend to pull a girl's braid so that he can be sent to the dunce corner and be seen in the dunce cap. And of course, everybody breaks up with laughter, but it was a serious thing. The children in the old days told me, in fact, one woman who's now in her 70s, she was there as part of the very last school. She said, you better behave because you might get home and somebody else had already told your mother that you did not behave right. So there was very much a self-disciplining area in that.
Well, Bronwen, thanks so much. Again, the Thinkin Rug, historical fiction book that, great insight into the main character, Levin, and the African-American community in Waterford. Available for purchase at the Waterford Foundation and through the link that's on our Facebook page with the Loudon Museum. And again, proceeds are going to the Waterford Foundation and the Black History Committee. So Bronwen, thanks so much for taking this time to talk a bit about the book, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.